Hello everyone, and welcome to the introduction to variables. All right, up to this point, we have designed our solution. Okay, that's our first things we did. We started walking through the checklist to get to the point of ensuring that we actually did all the processing necessary to actually determine all the outputs. Okay, or process, process all the outputs, I should say. That's great. Yay for us. You would do that no matter how complex the problem. You would do that. Okay. What we need to talk about now, though, is start getting into a little bit of programming concepts, okay? One of the things we need to do when we get into programs is we need to allocate some space for to hold some values. So I recommend that you consider that prior to diving into the program in regards to what you need. Probably a little confusing what I'm saying there. This is what it comes down to variables. We need to understand what type of variables we need to make our program work. So what this video is going to do is we're going to introduce the whole concept of a variable, and then we're going to understand how we use variables in programming, okay? And then when we get finished with this, we'll go back to our design and start identifying the variables based upon the problem in which we're actually solving for, all right? So let's talk about this. Variables in each program you will ever write, I'm talking about ever, forever and ever, you will need to hold values temporarily. A computer needs space somehow to take some values, do something with them, and then create output values, just kind of like what our solution did. But it needs to hold those values somewhere. And what we recommend, or what we state, or what every programming language wants you to do, is you're going to hold them in what's called a variable. Okay? And so that's how this all kind of works. Okay? Just one of the biggest concepts when it comes to programming is variables. Is one of the most important concepts in programming. Outside of probably the three structures of programming, which we talked about in the last video, variables are right there. As a matter of fact, if you understand those two concepts, you can pretty much go pick up just about any programming language that's out there once you understand how to apply it all. That's cool about it. Programming is programming. Okay. It's not hard. It's not supposed to be hard. The concepts of variables are nothing hard to know. It's just new to most of you. Okay. But variables are used in every programming language. That's what's beautiful about this. So once you finally get it, you will know what to do in every language you ever learn. As a matter of fact, you'll go to the next language and say, hey, how do I declare a variable? You'll know what that means and you'll get to that. Okay? So again, what's a variable? Sometimes people have a hard concept of what is it you're talking about now? What's this variable thing? So a variable is a term that basically means space, okay? And so it's space on a computer in which the computer is going to hold a value, all right? I look at it as nothing more than a piece of scratch paper. That if we did this all manually, the scratch paper would be our temporary area for the hold values. In computer world, they don't have scratch papers in computer world. The operating system doesn't know about that, but it has this thing called RAM, in which we can allocate some memory to hold our values. But if we want to equate it to something, we will equate it to scratch paper, okay? So let's think about this. Let's think about my dear lovely wife asked me to sum up a list of numbers that she is calling out across the room. For some reason, she screams at me. She doesn't scream, she talks loudly maybe, and she says, hey, can you sum up these numbers for me? And I go, okay, cool. How many are there? Well, I got about 7. All right, hold on. Let me get a scratch piece of paper so I can write them down temporarily, and then I can process them. Get the idea? Okay, so she screams across, that's screaming again. She says it firmly: 10, 14, 13, 11, 40, 30, and 20. And I write them down on my scratch piece of paper. Okay, again, once I'm done with all this, I don't really care about this anymore. I'm probably going to rip up the paper and throw it away, right? But temporarily, I write them all down so I can then process them, right? So these numbers that she politely stated to me across the room were 10, 14, 13. These would be my inputs. All right. So just like me, the computer needs a space to store these inputs. I did it on a piece of paper. The computer is going to need, the programming language is going to need this thing called a variable. It's the same thing. He may ask me to give her totals, on the first three numbers, and then on the first four numbers, and the overall total. And I would probably ask her why, and she might say, "Well, that's none of your business." And she's actually a pretty nice lady. And but all in all, that's what she would do. She goes, "Hey, can you give me those different totals?" And I go, "Okay, whatever you want. I'm not here to argue with you, of course, because I'm not going to win." So to do that, I would write down the total of the first three on the piece of paper. And I would sit back and I would have those seven on a piece of paper, add them all up, and I said that'd be 37, the first three. And the final four would add up to be 101. I would write those two down. So again, the computer would need a place to store those subtotals that I just talked about, okay? And again, it would need space to do so. And yep, that is what's called a variable. Then I would add them both together and give me the final total. Really, my overall goal for this was to give her a final total. And if I do that, it would be 138. All right. And so once again, the computer needs to temporarily store that final total until I'm ready to display it or until I'm ready to tell her the answer. And yep, that is a variable. Okay. Pretty simple, right? Most of the time, your variables, for the most part, are numeric. 90% of the time, maybe 95% of the time. We're going to get into data types actually in the next video, but most of the time it's for values that we're going to do some type of calculation on, but not all the time. I don't want to state that, but most of the time, okay? But to make this very simple, because I always get students who come to me who dive into the program without designing, and they say, I don't know what variables I need. Well, if you took the time up front to look at your solution, you would see I need variables for all my inputs, all my subtotals, and all my outputs. There might be some situations where you don't have subtotals. You'll know when you do. It's very obvious. You'll have totals in your solution that weren't part of your inputs or your outputs. Those are the subtotals. Okay. So in this case here, we would look at that. Okay. And again, when it comes to a computer or a programming language, obviously, we're not storing this on a piece of paper for it. We're going to store it in RAM, random access memory. This is temporary memory on your computer. And when we get into the actual programming of this, I'll show you how to do this. I will tell you how it works. I will tell you a lot of more things about variables as we get to the future of this. So based on our design, what we want to do instead of walking into our program oblivious of what variables we need, since we have this nice design we just spent time doing, we can sit back and actually look at the design and determine what variables we need. And this way, when we walk into our program or we get to our programming language, we can deal with them very, very easily. And you'll see how that works. Okay? So let's go back to our design real fast. I'm going to pull that up. Let's see, here it is right here. And I'll pull that over there. I'll pull it down. And also what I'm going to do is go ahead and get our little checklist back on here. Okay? So there's our checklist. As we talked about before, we got all the way down to solving one output at a time. The next thing you know is to determine the variables. And again, to determine the variables, you identify all inputs, all outputs, and all subtotals. I probably would agree this might still be a little confusing until you see the end result, so that's fine. So with that, just kind of follow along and just kind of understand. And then later on, we're going to implement these, and it might become much more clear what's actually going on. Okay? And you might even want to come back and listen to this whole thing again to make sure you're very clear on variables. Okay? So but in this case here, I'm trying to determine at this point in time what variables I'm going to need for my program. What things do I need to temporarily store for my program? I said all inputs, so here we go. We can come over here. This needs to be stored. This needs to be stored. These are my inputs, correct? We identified them right up here, okay? My outputs. Well, my outputs are right here. That would need to be, we need to create an area for that to be stored and that to be stored. Then I would look at all subtotals, and in this particular situation, we don't have any, and that's perfectly cool. So in a matter of just spending a few minutes with this up front, we already determined not only did we solve the problem, and we determined our variables, and you're going to see how this transposes into an actual program so easily. And if you follow these steps, how your life is going to be very easy to, your life will be a lot easier in writing your programs, okay? The next step is determining data types, and we'll talk about that here in the next video.